a lot of trouble to put on an exhibition. But this was really a passion project and something that the seed was planted for 7 years ago by the then director of the Graduate Library, Lynn Eddington, who made an open invitation for students to bring their work over here and fill these walls. This building was built about 20 years ago. It was designed with an art collection, so the art that you see was commissioned for this space. So it is its own collection, and the space was built with the gallery tracks and the rails, so it was designed with art in mind. But during the pandemic, this space has been totally quiet and had no artwork. And so I am deeply appreciative to Lynn Eddington and now Kathy Murphy, who's back there, and she can wave, who's librarian, to really just saying yes to anything that we ask. Can we move the furniture? You know, can we shift that carrel out of the way? Can we get new light bulbs in? You know, everything they just said yes to make the space as a little bit more gallery-like than library, at least temporarily. So I appreciate the collaborative spirit. The whole project has been pretty collaborative. When you have a little bit of grant money, and I applied for an American Rescue Plan grant, I know a few of you kind of know that, so I won't tell the entire story, but it is a positive example of trickle-down economics, where federal money goes to state and state goes to individuals, and individuals then take it out to those who are part of the project. So it's great to see the arts getting some of that. I want to make a couple of introductions for folks here. Here, kind of front and center, you can wave Elizabeth. Elizabeth Yeager is from the West Virginia Department of Arts, Culture, and History, and she's the individual, well, we say your proper title, so I don't.
Individual artist coordinator.
So individual artist coordinator. So, and with her is Jenna Brown, if you'll say your title.
The cultural facilities coordinator.
Very good, thank you. So also from the state
Yes.
arts department. So they came to Huntington on the Governor's Arts Caravan Tour in August and revolutionized how I thought about the state arts office. I'd applied for an individual grant before, I'd gotten an individual grant before, I'd emailed with Elizabeth before, we'd never met, but I was always real tentative, like, is this okay? Like, am I supposed to do this? I don't want to ask too many questions. When they came, they're like, we are here to help you. Let us hear your ideas so we can help you make them better and get them ready to make your application. That's what we are here to do. I'm like, oh, I did not understand that. So that really was empowering, and I intend to pass that on to colleagues and those I work with, that they know that you are here to help from idea generation to application and through to implementation. So thank you for coming tonight to be here. And Jenna, I know you do those types of things for everybody that you work with as well. We have a really proactive state arts office, so we're fortunate in that. The invitation from Lynn Eddington, the rescue plan funding helped this come about, but also to plan does take time. And so I want to give credit to the Drinkville Academy for having, for existing, and for, and for the Drinkville Fellowship Program. And as a recipient this past April of a Drinkville Fellow, I have some course release time. And so I'm trying to use that for the benefit of our students and our community. And so the American Rescue Plan and this project for our students is one aspect of what I've done with some of that course release time to bring this about. And Montserrat Miller, Dr. Miller, a historian at Marshall, is the executive director of the Drinkville Academy. You want to say anything?
Well, I'll just say I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm eager to hear all that will be said and presented. So I'm just a very thankful person in the audience.
Great, thank you. And Dan Holbrook is also here, a history professor from Marshall. I also brought 9 Jaeger scholars, wave crew. Yeah, so they're in a class this semester that's based in the Visual Arts Center that we're working through different ideas. We've been at the Clay Center all day seeing Van Gogh for All and some Japanese prints. Kara Bailey is the coordinator for the Jaeger program right here. And then a couple of students are here that I'll point out. So Barb Lavallee Benton, you want to wave? Yeah. Yeah. So Barb has this double-sided drawing here of Don't Let Fear Drive. So it's a work experience in the round. She was in ceramics last fall and created a couple dozen ceramic budgies, parakeets. And so we just had to bring some of them in. And the show wouldn't be complete, that wall would be empty if we did have them. So your pieces are a wonderful complement to one another and part of the exhibition. And then Emily Fuller, wave. Emily is here tonight as well. Her piece are these two beautiful drawings behind Jamie and Hannah. So these are Emily's pieces. Feels like art. So a pair of works. So really glad that a couple of the artists were able to come tonight. Colleagues from the School of Art Design, Art History, Rachel Danford, Foundations, Hannah Kozlowski, and our gallery director, Jamie Platt, kind of complete the crew for this evening. So thank you all for coming. The whole project has been, as I said, collaborative, and the grant made it possible for us to build out in a variety of ways. An important way that it's helped us to build out is through a collaborative author. And that brings us to Dr. Rachael Peckham, professor of English at Marshall. Coincidentally, Rachel is also a Drinko Fellow from, I believe, 2019 to 2021.
I think so. Is that right?
24.
2017, maybe?
Roughly. Actually, I think it's 2017 to.
2019.
Okay,
I don't know.
2017 to 2019.
Was a Drinko Fellow all the way.
Yeah.
The end date is.
And the English department and the School of Art Design have a very wonderful and productive relationship with one another. Rachel had always brought Jaeger students on our School of Art and Design trip. So we've gotten to know Rachel from those trips and also a lot of Jaeger students because we've been together in New York, including spring of 2020, when you were there.
I was not.
Oh, Rachel was there. Yeah, Rachel and I was there. So, you know, that's been, we kind of like know each other from that. But I didn't know that Rachel had been writing about flight. And so when I saw that on the Drinko Academy site, I thought, you know, I wonder if Rachel would want to work with us on this exhibition. And the theme evolved just from like when I saw the grant, like when the Governor's Art Caravan came through and said, here's all the possibilities. And the American Rescue Plan grant was a new one, and it was one of the biggest ones, and there was no matching money required. I said, you got to do something. It's about healing. It's about, you know, what we're all here to do. It's like, what can I think of to do? And so the idea of flight just came from looking at the context that we're in, of being at Marshall and the 50th anniversary of the plane crash having just passed, and the new aviation program that's based here in Charleston kind of coming up, and the longstanding invitation from the library to bring work over, and the Drinko time and the money. And I just said, what does that all add up to? And this is what it became. But when I saw that Rachel wrote about flight, I called her and said, you know, with like 2 days to spare before the application was due, like, you know, it's like, this is kind of cold calling you, but are you interested? And what did you say?
Yeah.
Exclamation point. Yeah. So, you know, so that became part of it as well, and a really important part. Rachel came and talked to the students and shared some of her work, wrote a preface for our zine, and then this piece tonight of Rachel sharing her writing with us is to bring a hybrid and a kind of fit between visual art and written arts. It is also selfishly to turn attention more deeply back to the students' work, so that as you hear Rachel talk about her, the role of flight in her life, and some of the creative nonfiction essays that she's been working on, that I hope that as you look at the work after this part of the evening is done, that you'll give yourself more full permission to look at the work through your own filter, through your own life experiences, and to empathize with the work, and to kind of give yourself kind of more grace and more kind of just to be kinder to yourself by looking at the students' work and kind of thinking about all that fits together. The American Rescue Plan grant is to heal communities from the impact of the pandemic, and making art, talking about art, looking at art are fundamentally healing. And so that's kind of what we're here to do. There is by Kara over here a survey, 3-question survey that will allow us to gather some data and some information regarding the evening, and which I'll report back to Elizabeth Hager at the State Arts Office in a few months and all. But if you would all complete that questionnaire before you leave, we'd appreciate it, as well as to sign it. We're trying to get 75 people to have seen the exhibition before it comes down. All right. Rachel Peckham is professor of English at Marshall, and I do have a little bio on here that I can probably read in 1-point font. You know, let me see if my
You don't have to
there we
do that.
so let's see. Okay, so Rachel Peckham's prose poems and lyric nonfiction have won prizes and appeared in Crab Orchard Review, Gulf Coast, Indiana Review, Hotel America, the Orison Anthology, Passages North, Southeast Review, South Loop Review, Tupelo Quarterly, and elsewhere. She holds a doctorate in creative writing from Ohio University and teaches at Marshall University, where she is a John Deaver Drinker Fellow and Professor of English. Rachel is currently at work on a collection of literary essays on flight and trauma, including an essay on the crash of Southern Airways Flight 932, otherwise known as the Marshall plane crash. Let's welcome Rachel Peckham.
Thank you so much, Sandra.
Rachel,
Yeah.
if we can pause for just 30 seconds. We're going to get some more chairs from the back so that everybody can sit. Students, could you assist? Yeah, could you assist bringing just a few more chairs?
Okay. I love that. Okay. Well, hi. Thank you for coming out. Weather, and especially thanks to Sandra. This has been a dream collaboration, and yes, there might have been some exclamation points involved when I responded to your email. I was extremely excited to do this collaboration, and it's also just a dream reading to get to share work in the presence of art and artists. So yeah, I'm just really excited for this. It's also poignant to look back and realize that before the world went sideways in March 2020, I was on a trip to New York City, like Sandra said, with several art students and faculty, and how special that was. I knew it was at the time, but even more so now in hindsight, I'm just so happy I got to have that experience with the Jaegers and the art students in New York. I'm trying not to think about the fact we were all in a ball pit at one point like, with many people, but it was okay. So I am going to read from work that grapples with the literal meaning of flight, but I also want to say that as an essayist, we never miss out on an opportunity to play with concepts and turn them over. So when Sandra let me know that the students and artists working on this project were going to be considering art from all different angles and interpretations, that just made me even happier to be part of it. The work that I'm going to read is from a collection of hybrid nonfiction, and all that means is that this is true material, but not every piece that I read is in the same form. So some of these forms are what we call prose poems. They're poems that look like paragraphs, but they function in the same way a poem would. They just don't have line breaks. And then other pieces I'm going to read are more narrative, more traditionally like essayistic. So, and the only other context I need to give you, I guess, is that, well, not just, but this is a major crux of this collection is that in 1976, my mother lost her father and two brothers in a plane crash in Michigan. It's before I was born. I grew up knowing about it, but I didn't know very much. I certainly didn't know what happened. And I wouldn't really pick up that question again until I was in college and started asking questions, and slowly my mom started to open up to me about it. And through my own research, I came to as close a theory as they have about what happened. So I'm going to read some sections that deal with that through the testimonies of some witnesses on the ground that heard the plane in distress. So this piece is called What They Heard. 3 separate witnesses testified to the guttural buzz of propellers overhead. It sounded like it was going to come right into the living room. Next came the blunt and unmistakable thud, freezing all of them in place but one, Bert Lloyd's wife, Peggy. A former flight attendant, Peggy sprang from the couch and ran to the driveway. He's down, he's down. That's what Bert remembers, Peg's words, more than the state of the weather outside. In fact, he remembers it being clear and dry when they both heard the plane's engines rev and whine, low and then high, going like a roller coaster in the middle of the 9 o'clock news. There was no doubt in his mind the pitch and sound meant one thing, some kind of trouble on board. He imagines somebody else was reaching over from the back seat trying to get a hold of those controls, somebody who didn't know how to fly. He's not alone in his theory. Bert's brother, Jack, he owns the land directly across the road from the crash site, readily believes the pilot suffered some kind of emergency, probably a heart attack. It explains, in the brother's view, why those engines changed in an instant. They didn't have time to circle. One neighbor, however, begs to differ. Judy Beamer had stayed up late canning tomatoes that night. It's the reason she knows exactly when the plane first circled overhead. I asked those government agents, does your wife can? Everyone who cans knows exactly what time it is. She's a real character. Yet investigators had a hard time believing her precise timeline and more. They couldn't fathom why she didn't see any lights coming from the plane. You must have seen lights, they said, because they thought they were landing. But it was foggy, Judy countered, and misty. Later, she'd wonder if the pilot wasn't the one actually to see lights through the fog. How easy it would be to mistake all the mercury lamps on these farms for the small lights of a landing strip. They weren't that far from the airport, and with that line of mercury lights there, well, I do wonder. Lights aside, what she did notice was how unusual it was for a plane to circle her house that low twice. She figured it was her brother-in-law, the only person she knew who flew, playing a prank on her while her husband was away on a fishing trip with friends. But when she heard the loud thud, like somebody had dropped a heavy sack of wheat on her front porch, she knew. She turned off every light in the living room. She stood at the window counting to 10. There was no sign of fire or smoke that she could see scanning the scene outside. The night was dark, and fog and mist blurred her field of vision. To her frustration, that's exactly what the state police told her when she called. You're just hearing swamp gas, ma'am. Talking to her like she was a child afraid of things that go bump in the night. She hung up. She called her neighbor Bert Lloyd, and together they drove along the fields between their houses, searching for the downed plane they knew was there. It didn't take long to find it. The impact had raised a large swath of the unharvested field, as though a piece of paper had been folded in half and a jagged heart cut out of its center. Where the plane had struck, it jutted out from the ground at a 60-degree angle. Everything drove into the ground, Bert said. I mean, everything. They backed out of the field then and tore straight through Judy's front yard. We didn't even use the driveway. This time, the state police responded. Bert led the troopers back to the crash site. Together, they peered into the fuselage, what was left of it, to try to identify the victims. At the memory, Bert closes his eyes. Jack was away, fishing up north alongside Judy's husband, Rex, but he too came home to a ghastly sight. The trees bordering Jack's field acted as a net, catching debris and more in the force of impact. Judy sighed. No one would take responsibility for the cleanup, not the coroner's office, not the authorities or the aviation agencies. They all said, it's your land, lady. Rex wasn't due home for another 2 days, and it was still fairly hot in mid-September. By the time the evidence was collected and the cleanup begun, the best neighbors could do was dig trenches in the field and bury what they could as fast as they could, breathing into their sleeves. That's not even the worst part, Judy said. It was the gawkers, the line of drivers going by, all trying to get a look. One time I came home and there were people standing on the roof of my home. It would all prove too much. Less than a year after the crash, she and Rex sold their house and farm and left Michigan, left a life of farming altogether, and moved to the San Juan Islands in the Northwest, just off the coast of Washington. Now it takes Judy an hour on the ferry just to get to town. And the irony is, she said, I hate boats. That's Judy. This piece is called Ghosts Would Appear. My family loves to bring up the home video of me at 3 or 4, striking poses and performing a private monologue to no one they could see anyway. My siblings can be heard giggling in the background, but if I noticed, I didn't care. It was easy to lose yourself in reverie where we lived in Michigan, with miles of green in every direction, a space you could populate with the company of your imagination. I was never lonely in the country. While my siblings worked on their basketball shots in the driveway, I sat in the basement working out storylines for my dolls. And when I did my daydreaming outside, it was to ride my bike with Jennifer, I couldn't say ends, the imaginary friend I teamed up with to race the villainous red team. I still love this about make-believe, the inherent construction of it, even if nobody could see what I was busy making, believing. Yet these same fantasies could turn on me. I became increasingly risk adverse, envisioning awful scenarios while my siblings did backflips off the diving board or swung like Tarzan on barn rope, making the rafters groan. It made me panicky, their horsing around, but it never worked to ask them to stop, a recipe for teasing. And as much as I tried, I couldn't ignore them at the adults beckoning. There was something crucial about my surveillance. I couldn't look away, as though watching was the only thing keeping disaster at bay. It wasn't just my siblings' antics that triggered my anxiety. When I closed my eyes at night, I feared ghosts would appear at my bedroom door. And sitting in a darkened movie theater, my hands would sometimes tingle. Once it started, I knew it would keep on climbing up my arms until my lips felt completely numb and my eyelids began to twitch. The worst attack came during the Vietnam scene in Forrest Gump. Watching the men run at the sound of the planes, watching the ground erupt and fire all around them, killing some, dismembering others, I couldn't catch my breath. The harder I tried to get it back, the more I panicked, until Mom looked over and saw my face. I don't know what's happening. She put me in the car and we drove block after block all around Coldwater, Michigan. I could tell we were really circling the hospital, but my mom must have sensed I needed her to keep on driving. I needed a steady and mindless activity, the opposite of imagination, to slowly bring the world back into focus. We didn't speak about the attack much after that, but we both seemed to know I did better when I stayed busy. And there was no shortage of activity between church and school and playing 3 sports year-round. But none of it gave me as much pleasure as creative expression. And this was a language that my mom, a music teacher and organist, and I both shared. This is why, when I first told her that I was writing about the plane crash for a college writing assignment, I knew this was my best shot at getting her to open up. Will you help me, Mom? I want to say we were in the car, that it was the forward movement of driving that helped me screw up enough courage to go there, but more likely it unfolded over email. We still trade them from time to time, long heart-to-hearts about the things we have trouble saying aloud. which in my soft-spoken Midwestern family is plenty. My husband, a New Englander, likes to tease that my family's most tense conversations register the decibel only dogs can hear. Writing has always been our safest vehicle. I might be able to, my mom replied, if I can write it in a letter. This is the first letter. Shock is the body's way of self-preservation. The most vivid thing about the period of shock is the suspension of time. Time has no meaning, no relevance. It's like being in a corked bottle carried over water. I was present, but not there. The sight of the 3 caskets lined up at the front of the church was wrenching. I remember we needed smelling salts to stay conscious. Our family was suddenly without grandpas or uncles. My mother's father died from a heart attack on Christmas Eve almost 20 years earlier, and mom was an only child. My father an only son. There was no one left to carry on the family name. My professor from Hillsdale College played the funeral. Mark Graham, Rod Wiltsey, and Lester Bailey officiated. That was the last time we went to church there. I know our church family felt rejected. Still, I'm thankful for that Methodist church. It was there that Doug and I sang in children's choir. We were active in the youth group there. Mike and I were married there. I'll always remember Dad walking me down the aisle. That even now, I can't muster the willpower to enter that building. So my mom's writing is also threaded in this collection, which was pretty poignant for me. I'm going to read now a prose poem in which that active imagination is cast on the character of my uncle Doug. So this was my mom's older brother, who ironically was taking flying lessons and was just about to solo around the time that he died. He was not flying the plane, however, I should note that when they died. So this is a prose poem called Doug Takes a Flying Lesson. And my uncle Doug had gotten divorced before he died, and it was a pretty painful time, not just for him, but for my whole family, I'm told. Doug takes a flying lesson. He taxis up and down a band of runway. His first lesson, get to know the plane. At an hour safe from the babble of takeoff and landing, when the airfield lies blank as a board, when he should still be doing chores because everybody's just worried about him since the divorce, and they squeeze his shoulder and lower their chins, and you'd think he'd been drafted or had run from a crime. And is it really escaping when he's back by lunchtime? He presses the brake on command and the plane rocks in place. He knows this pace. It's the rhythm of breakup on and off for 2 years. It's the push and pull nature of wanting different things. It's being in business with a father who's scared to take a risk. His dad would rather be left than to take the first step. Do you know why we do an engine run up? Doug feels like shrugging. Enough with the checks. He just wants in the air. You have to make sure each cylinder is firing. We talked about carburetor ice, and Doug knows this too, the danger of rushing, of never testing what each other would not and could do, how fast it builds up and burns out, when no amount of touch or words or cash, not always in that order, can recover what's stalled. And it hurts to look at her when she asks if you're done, how it flies in your face, the whole thing, all the checks deposited in her name, and nobody's touch or words can soothe the feeling you failed at this too. And how is he supposed to know if a wind shear occurs just before a cold front passes overhead? How can the same air that feeds it be the death of a fire? This is the last piece I'm going to read, and it's another prose poem about an experience that my grandmother allegedly had, and she never told anyone in the family about it. And I only came to find out about it because I found a newspaper clipping that she had kept. And she was one of the people interviewed about this experience, that several people in Coldwater, my mother's hometown, they had this sighting And like I said, Grandma never talked about it. So this is called Last Testimony. A passerby, a guy who drove truck hauling grain, spotted it first and jumped from his cab to knock on the nearest door. I'm sure my grandma crossed her arms, so cautious and probably pressed for time, dressed in her nursing uniform, and it makes me think she knew the guy. Why would she follow him otherwise? Or maybe she looked into his unblinking eyes, big as saucers, we say, and realized he needed help. Or maybe she heard in his tone someone else's emergency, that adrenaline surged to the legs. She follows his hand, stabbing the sky at a spot just a quarter-mile up over the channel where she and my grandfather lived years before he'd die in an airplane. And you better believe I see the cliche, done to death, as we say, the cigar-like craft hovering in the air long enough for a fishing boat to pass and wave at my grandma, and then bam, it disappears. Silent as quicksilver slipping from the palm, or like a dot of static on the television, that quietly gone. Not a trace of exhaust in its place, but the image will stay perched in her mind. She'll try to describe it, first with her neighbors, then to the town when the daily shows up. And here's the takeaway. The peculiar stillness of a thing so near the ground, you'd expect to hear some fire in the engine, some kind of idling sound, but it wasn't flying at all. What my grandmother saw, this wasn't any kind of flight she recognized. Thank you. So I know that was heavy material, but I'd be happy to take questions or just have a conversation about the themes of flight that you see around you and that appear in my work. Anybody? Yes.
Did you take anything from the paintings that are here? I mean, or any of the work?
This material was written actually a few years before this exhibit with the support of a Drinkle Fellowship. So no, I didn't necessarily write in response to the work, but I think it's very uncanny that so many of the interpretations of flight are ones that I've encircled too. And maybe that's not surprising, but certainly flight can mean a lot of things. Escape, I think for my uncle Doug who took flying lessons, it was a way to get above it all. So I see that in some of the work here. I see other pieces that definitely, you know, interpret flight as some kind of recovery, a rising up. So I'm fascinated by those sort of common denominators, but no, it wasn't that kind of collaboration. Good question though. Yes.
First of all, I just want to say, like, I love the prose poems so much, and that kind of stream of consciousness way that you have of conveying the information. It's really emotive, and and I'm just curious about, particularly the one with your grandmother. You said that you found out about that from a newspaper article.
Yeah.
What is the process like for you going from a newspaper article to creating a poem?
Great question. So I think the reason I sometimes reach for a prose poem is because it gives me a stage, some kind of space where I can do some speculation, or I can get inside a character's head more directly than I can through literary journalism or through personal essay. So it's not so much that I take my research and I automatically know this is a prose poem or this is an essay. It's that I think I'm always trying to get at a question any way I can. So sometimes I'll take a piece of research and I'll write about it first in one form, and then it will come back as I'm writing in a prose poem. Or I don't know. I think it's just all swimming around up there, and that's what I like about hybrid work, is that it does allow you maybe to perform an idea as much as just write about it or write around it. But it was fascinating to me that my grandmother, who was very soft-spoken, and she was a nurse, so very pragmatic. She never gossiped about people. She never said an unkind word, and she certainly never talked about having a UFO sighting. Like, it amazed me to see that she opened up to a reporter about that, but never to her family. And I just thought it was really ironic that she had that experience years before the crash. So, yeah, that was a wild thing to find that article. Yeah. So, sure, thanks for the question. Rafael?
So over the course of like creating all of these works, how do you think that your conception of light has changed? Because obviously, I would think general media, light is typically a very positive thing, but
Right.
considering like your family's history with light, I would understand like it would not be quite so positive and rather tragic. So how does that, kind of work for you, like the idea of light in your life?
Thanks. I don't know if it's morphed so much as certain themes continually get reinforced. And I shouldn't be surprised by that, but in researching the Marshall plane crash and talking to surviving family members, the victims, it gave me goosebumps to hear them say some things that were almost verbatim what my mom said. Even though on a scale, that crash was much bigger, the fundamental feelings that surviving family members have, they're kind of the same. You feel, at least my mom said she felt like her dad and brothers just vanished. And I heard that again and again in talking to the Marshall community and the Southern Airways community too, because they suffered loss too. So I tried to reach out to them, and that was really important. I think maybe that was more so a revelation for me, was listening to the loved ones of those crew members talk about not only their grief, but their residual guilt and just the anguish of feeling like apart from the grieving community. And I think that's gotten a lot better. Marshall, a lot of people have reached out to the Southern Airways family, and there's been some healing, I think, that's happened over the years recently. But I don't know as though I necessarily think differently about this kind of loss. I just know that it is a different kind of loss. There's something about it that's fundamentally different. And I go into that in other parts of the manuscript about just the taboo of flying. We're not designed to do it, really. Our bodies aren't. So I think sometimes plane crashes reaffirm that deep-seated anxiety in us, that we're not supposed to be doing this thing. But any other questions? Montserrat?
Well, I've really enjoyed hearing you read again.
You've had to hear a lot of this material.
No, not enough. Not enough. I mean, I've loved every opportunity, and I don't think I've heard any of the particular, but I think Art Spiegelman and Mouse 1 and Mouse 2 are in everybody's mind. And I love those books. And one of the big takeaways for me was the way in which the author conveyed the inherited trauma.
Right.
And I had never really thought, when I was first reading these in the 90s or whenever, about the way in which trauma can pass from one generation to another. And I just was wondering whether what happened in your family is a trauma that you're working through artistically.
I definitely think that there's something striking about the fact that my younger brother and I, who were born after this plane crash, have really strong feelings negatively and positively about flight. So my younger brother is a pilot. He knew he was going to be a pilot from the time he could talk. And whereas I have always harbored a phobia of it. And I don't really know what to say about that. I don't know if it's because of intergenerational trauma, but I do find it striking. So I've done a little bit of research about that concept, and it comes up in my work. But for those of you who aren't familiar with intergenerational trauma or historical trauma, researchers are finding that the way that generations born after trauma metabolize stress is different, that they often are plagued with anxiety disorders and other like health problems that there's just too much of a pattern there to ignore. So it's really fascinating. And if you want to know more about that, the psychologist that is probably most renowned for this theory is Rachel Yehuda, Yehuda. So I would encourage you to check her stuff out. It's fascinating. But yeah, I think that is true too for the Marshall community. I mean, definitely trauma, I think, reverberates in our community in terms of like identity too. You know, Marshall's identity is largely staked now on this history, on this shared history of trauma. So psychology aside, I think that it's a good question to take up, to consider our relationship to tragedy, which I think can be constructive. I think, as Sandra pointed out, like this event, I think is proof that it can bring people together and inspire connections and certainly art. So yeah, and I hope that that's what I'm doing with this material. Like I think it's been really a positive thing for me and my mom, certainly, to explore this together. So, thank you, Montserrat. Else? We ready to have some refreshments?
Wait.
Yeah.
Is there, will there be a way for people to
Yes, honey?
purchase? Will there be a way for people to purchase this work that you've been reading?
Hope so, yes. It's this collection is short, 75 pages, and it's due to come out with a small independent press later this spring. So I hope you'll be able to get it. Thank you for the question. Very subtle.
What's the title?
Alight, A-L-I-G-H-T, Alight. Thanks. Thank you so much.
A round of applause. So much, Rachel, for sharing that. There's nothing like the firsthand experience of artwork unmediated through digital form, and to hear firsthand from the author is even, I think, more rare and special. So, I mean, it really comes across at so many additional levels of reading, that the sound of the words and the sound of the author's voice with those words is just really tremendous. So much. Thank you. Of the 14 works in this exhibition, 4 or 5 of them are rooted in processing of trauma. And so the artist statements that are in the little booklet, everybody should take one of those home, but the statements, the students worked hard on those to come up with something that was relatively brief, but poignant and expressive, communicative about their kind of take on flight, their approach to flight. Both artists here tonight have responded to various sources of trauma. So, Emily and Barb are both going to be around here for the remainder of the event. If you would like to talk with them, that you can seek out them and talk with them about their ideas. I will offer to Barb, would you like to talk about your work? You can say, no, sorry, I didn't set anything up there. Yeah.
No, I mean, if you'd like me to, I will.
Yeah, you speak about it so well, and you're getting some encouragement. It's the large work back here. And Barb, you can totally decline finger snaps and all. All right. That's
I need to learn. Here's a liar. And this side here was the first side, and it's called Fear Drive. What encouraged me to do this was an experience that I had, which was very traumatic at the time. And when I started working on this, I got a little bit emotional, and some of the negative emotions started coming back. I sort of had little triggers. And so through what I had gone through, I had learned how to handle some of those things. And through the healing, I started working on this side. And that was totally unexpected. Like, I went back to class and was like, hey, I have another one. Because I just couldn't get through this one. So I felt like I was in a vortex, and that's kind of where the vortex came from. And during that time, I was driving around, and I would just stop certain places. And so I was very insistent about my foot being in there, which at first was, I think, a little awkward and weird for everybody. But it just brought me into that moment of being in that trauma and just really literally not knowing whether I was coming or going. And so I was just very determined that it was going to stay in there. I think it worked out. So I also discovered during this time of learning how to use soft pastels, of writing with a graphite pencil on the black, and I just fell in love with that because you can change where you're standing and you can't see it, or you can see it according to your perspective. And I really thought that was pretty cool. And so then the other side, as I said, I started simultaneously just switching from one to the other one. And this one, I just walk around here, I'm like, oh, like I feel peace myself when I walk to this side of it. But from the experience that I went through, I just had to learn how to forgive. I had to learn how to just not look back. I had to learn how to just let things go. And that's pretty much just what I'm expressing on this side. And it was very, very powerful things to learn in my life. And I was just trying to get that into an art piece. So for me, that's what it was all about.